Let's see what's waiting. Hello, everybody. Everybody's signing on. I have a big crowd for a Sunday night. This is a short version of just one chapter, the environmental law chapter. I hope it isn't too inconvenient for people to sign on. This is just a bonus chapter. You can count it towards your hours, but it's not a required day for you to be on here. I'm going to continue to try to run these in smaller increments and then have the big classes on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Now that PSI is open, we really want to accelerate the hours so you guys can get licensed. Market's great, and it might take you, a couple of weeks to get a PSI appointment. Did get a email today from one of the people who was in the class who passed her test. She said it wasn't that hard, so that's good news, right? And let's get started in a second.
You're killing me. Onions aren't bad. Here, eat around it. And the green stuff is not going to kill you. If you try it, you might actually like it. Connor, what's your take on it?
All right, so environmental laws, chapter 27, and we have to be aware
Bruce,
of
you need to mute
laws,
everybody.
When
Bruce.
we're doing real estate, because we have some responsibility in what happens with transactions and responsibility for recording and documenting what goes on. And in order to
Bruce,
get
you
deals
need to
closed,
mute everybody.
many times we want to make sure that things are taken care of. So first of all, New Jersey is the most densely populated state. And one of the mottos from New Jersey used to be, when you cross from New Jersey and Trenton to Philadelphia,
Can he not hear
on
us?
the bridge, it still says it, what Trenton makes, the world takes. And that's because we were a manufacturing company. There were many chemical companies here in New Jersey, and there were many manufacturing companies here in New Jersey. So we were a big manufacturing state. And unfortunately, while we were a manufacturing state, a lot of the manufacturers would just dump their byproducts into the groundwater. And eventually it took its toll, especially being such a small state without so much surface area. So we have a lot of environmental risks. We've got spots all over New Jersey with specific environmental risks that are from former plants, the Sherman-Williams plant, former manufacturing plants, an old burn site, an old dump site, things all over North Jersey to South Jersey. And so we've got to be aware of the obstacles and the hazards and the radiation types that all those things sort of present to us. So the first thing we want to talk about is the Private Well Testing Act. There still are many properties in New Jersey where the drinking water is served by a well. I live in Colts Neck, and in Colts Neck, there is no public water, so everybody has a well. And one of the things with wells is sometimes a lot of the stuff that might have been put into the groundwater from manufacturing, or that might be into the groundwater from somebody's septic system leaking, any of those things might create some problems in well water. So in New Jersey, we have a Private Well Testing Act. And Janice, thank you. I do need to mute all when I start a meeting. Sometimes we get started and I didn't realize there was noise until it started. So everybody hopefully is muted. You can unmute yourself and I will remute you back again. So again, the Private Well Testing Act in New Jersey is here to protect people, homeowners in New Jersey, from having wells that have different kinds of health hazards in them. So the rule in New Jersey says that any time you have a well that supplies the potable water supply, then the seller has to check the well, and it's very expensive now to check the well. It runs $700, and the seller has to provide the results to the buyer. The act does not say the seller has to fix it. It just says the seller has to present the results to the buyer. And when you look at these maps, what they do is when they test your well, They record all of the pollutants or biohazards they might find in the well, and then they geocode them, and then they report them, and they can actually kind of generate maps that from all the different sets of data that they put together. They might be able to see a trend or see a flow. And if you look at the bottom row, the middle one, you see there's like a red flow across that area of New Jersey. So that's obviously a specific chemical that at a specific point there that was all in one area and flowed in a certain direction. Who knows whether it's from groundwater or from a river or from a string of environmental hazards in that area. But what we do need to know that if you have a well that's the potable water supply, the seller has to test the well and provide the results to the buyer. Now, if you have a well like this, that's just a well used to, for decorative purposes, or a well that's used to get water to water your lawn, no, you don't have to check that. It's only if it's the potable supply. That's the water that you use for drinking in your house. And in my house in Colts Neck, we have a water softener and we have a treatment system. We have a lot of arsenic and a lot of iron in the water in Colts Neck. Other places have other materials in the water supply. And you're always, when you have a septic system, and again in Colts Neck, they don't have public sewers, they have septic systems. You want to make sure that your septic system isn't leaking biological matter into your well. So again, that's the reason for the Private Well Testing Act. And contracts have to have a private well testing addendum if you have a well that is your potable water supply. Next thing we want to talk about is underground storage tanks. Underground storage tanks are really prevalent in New Jersey. Not every town has natural gas. Towns 100 years ago didn't have natural gas. So when we heated, 100 years ago, we would heat with coal. 80 years ago, we would probably heat with oil, and we kept oil tanks underground. So there is an underground storage tank law, and it deals with tanks that are 2,000 gallons above. The upper left-hand corner tank is a tank that's 2,000 gallons, but we don't find that around homes. That's typically found in a gas station, or typically found at a chemical or a factory site that's storing fuel or other chemicals underground. The other three tanks are, in fact, homeowner tanks that are actually leaks and properties that I've had listed and that we have had to remove tanks from. If I'm representing a buyer, I always suggest to my buyers that we remove any oil tanks that might be there. Even if they were abandoned and filled with sand, I still suggest that we get them removed. And the reason I suggest we get them removed is you never know what happened before they were filled with sand. And if you were to buy a house that did have a tank still in the ground, when you go to sell it, there's a high degree of probability the buyer who's buying it from you is also going to ask to have it removed. So you might as well get it removed now. When they remove underground oil tanks, you have to file a permit with your municipality. The municipality comes out and observes you unearth the tank. And you can see the little lids they've cut off on all of the tanks. On all of the tanks, they've made a cut, like a trap door. Here's one here, here's one here, and here's one here. And then they look inside. They look inside to see if there's any water, because if there's water inside the tank, it would indicate that the tank was leaking. And they look in the dirt to see if there's any evidence of any leak in the dirt. And they shine a light inside to see if they can see any light, because if they can see any light, that's an evidence there's pinhole leaks. If there is no leak, then the town allows the people who are removing the oil tank to take it away. And usually they take it away and they either take it to a foundry to have it melted down, or they take it to somewhere at a site to bury them. But usually they're going to take them to melt them down. But if it did have a leak, like the one in the lower left-hand corner, now they have to notify the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and it opens a file. It creates a lien on the house until that tank is remediated. And if it has a leak, what has to happen is you have to do the remediation. Sometimes that means removing soil. Sometimes it means drilling wells to test the groundwater. That's always like a really, really bad case if it's hit the groundwater. And once you have done all the things that you need to do to remediate it, you have to have a geologist come in, and the geologist gives you a letter of no further action. When that letter of no further action gets to Trenton, it removes the lien, and then you can close on the property. So these are all fairly common. The two tanks on the center and on the right that did not leak, it might cost $2,000, maybe a little bit less to pull them out. The tank on the far right, you see that we had to tear up the driveway to get it out, which means we have to repave the driveway again after it's taken out. A little more expensive to repave the driveway. But now those tanks are out. Now those tanks are out, and you never have to worry about them again. Now, even if the house still needed oil to heat it, I would advise taking underground storage tanks out and put that oil tank in your basement, or putting it above ground outside, but not in the ground. The next environmental hazard we worry about is asbestos. Asbestos is a mineral fiber that's used to insulate for heat. It's a very good insulator for heat. It also is a very strong, has very strong properties for making a certain kind of floor tile. And so a lot of times you'll see asbestos floor tiles in basements because they last forever. Nothing hurts them. But quite often we see asbestos wrapped on pipes in order to save heat. And the asbestos that's wrapped on this pipe, this is an actual pipe that in one of my listings, this pipe is becoming what they call friable. And you can see that the covering is starting to wear out, and we're getting, you can see the little cotton-like fibers coming off the pipe, and as they break off in small pieces, they become airborne, and as you breathe them in, the radical shape of the asbestos molecule is an irritant to your lungs, and you get asbestosis. Now, even if you have asbestos in your basement, there's no law that says you have to remove it. Removing the asbestos is negotiation between the buyer and the seller as part of your contractual process. Okay, there's no law that says you have to take it out. There's no law that says a homeowner is able to take out the asbestos on his own. That says he can't, but he can't dispose of it. So the problem is you need a licensed remediation company to remove it. When they remove it, typically they're going to spray it down really well. The remediation company is, of course, going to wear protective gear. They wet it down so that the molecules don't go flowing all over your house as they're working on it. They create a negative pressure by putting a tent up and then putting a gigantic vacuum pump to create a negative pressure so that the molecules don't go floating around your house. And when they're done, when the pipes are bare, they paint the pipes with a red-colored sealing paint. Not sealing like over your head sealing, but a sealant paint. And that red paint is very indicative that it was professionally done. So when homeowners remove it themselves, the home inspectors will typically catch it, and then it'll still require remediation anyway. Again, no law says you have to fix asbestos. It's part of the negotiation. And again, asbestos causes asbestosis, which is a type of lung cancer, asbestos cancer. And the problem is your lungs don't have the ability to dissolve anything that gets into your lungs. The next thing is urea, formaldehyde foam insulation, especially in older homes where they have plaster and lath walls. There's no way to get insulation into those homes to retrofit them with insulation. So you would drill holes into the plaster and you would shoot your urea formaldehyde foam insulation in. And back in the 1980s, they did some scientific work and they said that urea formaldehyde foam insulation would degenerate into a uric acid gas, and it was a health hazard. So they made it illegal, and then they redid the studies again a few years later, and they made it legal again. But this confusion over illegal for a period, then legal for a period, has made people shy away from it completely. And again, there's no law that says you have to remove urea formaldehyde foam insulation. It's part of the contract negotiations. The next thing is carbon monoxide poisoning. carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas, and it's the result of incomplete combustion of fossil fuels. So incomplete combustion of natural gas, of oil, of kerosene, propane, whatever you're using that's got a fossil fuel and it doesn't burn correctly or doesn't get vented correctly, it creates carbon monoxide gas. It's colorless and it's odorless and it's lighter than air, so it floats up. So if you're running a generator in your basement, when the lights go out and the generator is not performing 100%, you might create carbon monoxide gas. And here is a story from June 15, 2019. That's exactly what happened here. 1 dead, 3 hospitalized after carbon monoxide poisoning in Bernardsville, New Jersey. You know, he was probably running a generator because of a summer lightning storm, lost power. And again, people die in their sleep because you don't feel it's happening to you. So how do we make sure you don't get carbon monoxide poisoning? You have carbon monoxide detectors. And the new laws for carbon monoxide detectors say they have to be the sealed battery type. They can't have replaceable batteries. They have to be less than 5 years old. And every time you sell a house or rent a house, you have to have an inspection for the fire alarms, the smoke alarms, and the carbon monoxide detectors. The carbon monoxide detectors have to be within 10 feet of every bedroom. And if your house was built recently, the building code, if it was a recently built house, might call for carbon monoxide detectors in every bedroom. But if it's an old house and you're going to put battery operated ones up, they have to be within 10 feet of every bedroom. So you might be able to put the detector in the hall and have it service all 3 bedrooms. Fire extinguishers have to be in the kitchen, has to be a 210 AB fire extinguisher size. Smoke alarms have to be on every level of the house. So the basement, the first floor, the second floor, and the attic all have smoke detectors. And again, you have an inspection. Typically, the seller pays for the inspection, typically because on bank-owned properties, the banks make the buyers pay for the smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, and fire extinguishers. So again, in between each transaction, each sale or each rental, there needs to be an inspection just to make sure you don't have people dying in the house of carbon monoxide poisoning. All right, we have a lot of sites in New Jersey that had previously been landfills. Again, going back to the 1950s and 60s and earlier than the 50s, every town had a landfill. And then as New Jersey started to fill up with people and that land became valuable again, there was a temptation to build on top of the land. So under the Sanitary Landfill Facility Closure Act, if you're building on top of a landfill, then the seller has an obligation to inform the buyer as to what that property was used for and for how long if it was a landfill. So we have to notify and inform our buyers in the event we do have a building or a development going up on top of what was an old sanitary landfill. The next thing is lead paint. And lead paint was a very, very normally used paint in New Jersey. The #1 paint was Dutch Boy White. It was a very, very good paint. It never wore out. It never faded. You could paint your house once and it would last for 20 years. The problem is it had a lot of lead in it. That's what made it so good. And anything before 1978 probably had lead. In 1978, lead was made illegal in many things, like gasoline. That's why we have unleaded gas. 1977, we had leaded gas, and before. In 1977, we had leaded paint. In 1978, no more lead in the paint. Dutch Boy paint is especially onerous what they did in terms of their marketing, because they created a cute little childlike image for the Dutch Boy paint. They even had little lamps that were the Dutch Boy that they gave out for free. And they knew how bad lead was, but they did this anyway with the lead paint. And the problem with lead paint is it has a sweet taste. especially for children who have very, very sensitive taste buds. And you would quite often find bite marks on windowsills where little toddlers had bitten the windows, or also eaten lead paint chips, or run their hands and fingers along windowsills to get dust and then sucked on their fingers because it did have a little bit of a sweet taste. And the lead in the paint caused neurological damage that had a cumulative effect that would not go away. And it also had a direct relationship to body mass. And children have much smaller body masses than adults. So just a little bit of lead would cause grave neurological damages. So after 1970, from 78 on, we're not allowed to have lead in paint or lead in gasoline. When we sell a house or when we rent a house, there's a law that says we have to give a lead paint disclosure addendum. And in that lead paint disclosure addendum, the owner of the house is going to, first of all, he's going to have a seller's disclosure, and he's going to let the buyer know whether he has knowledge or reports of any lead. So yes or no, I have knowledge, and down here, yes or no, I have reports. The buyer is going to get an opportunity to do a lead assessment. And the seller is also going to say that in the event he finds lead at a later date, he'll let the buyer know. And then this has to be signed by the buyer. It has to be signed by the seller. It has to be signed by the listing agent and the buyer's agent. So everybody has to sign this lead addendum. And it's a $10,000 fine if the EPA catches that you did not get it all signed and the house was indeed built before 1978. What this means also is if you have a house that was built in 1900 and you tear it all the way down, but you leave the foundation there and you rebuild everything from the foundation up, you still have to have this lead addendum because the foundation is still there from pre-1978. That's a lead addendum. And again, if you have lead in a house in Highland Park, many of the houses were built in 1910, 1920. So when they were built, they had a lot of lead in them. If you have lead in a house, typically it costs $25,000 to get rid of all traces of lead in the house. But it's really, many people feel, not a gigantic risk if the house is painted with newer paint and the paint is encapsulating all the old lead paint, and you don't have lead pipes in your drinking water so that you're leaching lead from the pipes into your drinking water. So in other words, it's something that is not a death knell on a house just because it has some lead. Almost all houses that were built before 77 have plenty of lead in them. It's just a matter of, is the risk been brought down to its lowest level by subsequent painting. Now FHA, because of their knowledge of lead, will not allow any peeling or flaking paint on houses that the FHA is insuring loans on. So quite often when the FHA appraiser comes out, he'll appraise the house as per value and say, well, it appraised for the value. However, you've got peeling and flaking paint, and before they'll issue the FHA addendum for the insurance, they'll make sure that all the flaking and peeling paint has been scraped and sanded and painted over. The next thing is radon. Radon is a colorless, odorless gas, and radon is heavier than air. So it's a gas that's heavier than air, which means it doesn't float up and go away. Radon comes from the decay of a radioactive isotope, and it gets pushed up through your basement floor by the pressure of the soil around your house or the pressure of the water in the soil around your house, and even the barometric pressure. Very, very dry days, like we have in early October, those days the air is very, very heavy. And when that air is very, very heavy, it exerts a little bit extra pressure, and sometimes that pushes the radon up through the floor in your basement, because you might think the floor in your basement is completely non-porous, but it's very porous for molecules of a gas. Now, when that radon gets pushed up through the floor of your house, it lays on the basement floor in a very thin layer. The way they check for radon is they put a canister with charcoal in it in your basement. They collect a sample of air and the radon gas, then they send it out to be analyzed. And the level that they will accept in radon gas is 4 picocuries per liter or less. If it's more than 4 picocuries per liter, then typically they're going to the buyer will ask you to remediate. But again, there is no law that says the seller has to do this. This is negotiation. So if you do find radon, they're going to put one of these devices on the outside of your house. Inside that device is a pump. That pump is creating, again, an airflow. It's bringing air from your basement floor. And what they do is they dig a hole in your basement floor. And then, of course, they put a covering over it. And so now the radon gas flows into that hole in your basement floor because it's heavier than air. And then this pump extends into that canister. And that pump pumps it into here and then takes it out over top of your roof and disperses it. Disperses it just into the outside around your house. That's it, radon, again, around your house, the concentrations are so little it doesn't hurt anything to do that. And again, here, things you can do, you can put a radon stop membrane on the floor of your basement. You can also here's where they put the little canister, and they pump the radon gas as it fills into the canister. They pump it out and vent it on top of the house. Those are some of the ways that they do treat for radon gas. Now, one of these devices will cost you around $2,500. Again, there's no law that says you have to treat for radon. It's negotiation between the buyer and the seller. And the acceptable level is 4 picocuries per liter. And picocuries is a measurement of radiation. It's named after Madame Curie. And I want to remind you that Madame Curie, who discovered radiation, died of radiation poisoning. So again, if radon is something that you're concerned with, 4 picocuries per liter or less. The next thing is electromagnetic fields. So this is a house that is in S.A.R.A. If you look behind the house, you'll see high tension wires. When these type of wires are near a house, through external obsolescence, it reduces the value of the house. So when we did the chapter on appraising, we talked about external obsolescence, and having a high tension wire near your house will reduce the value of your house. The reason they call them high tension wires, the word tension refers to that it's high voltage going through those lines. So those lines have very high voltage going through them. And according to rules of electric behavior, anytime you pass current through a line, there's an electromagnetic field created using the right-hand rule, that tells you which direction the field is going. And that field can be thought to cause a health hazard. These high tension wires are not a proven health hazard. They are not a proven health hazard. If these electromagnetic fields were a proven health hazard on very low radiation amounts, your cell phone would not be allowed because you produce electromagnetic radiation from your cell phone and you put it right up next to your head, or even worse, you put it in your pocket. So again, we want to remember that electromagnetic fields are not a proven health hazard. However, they are an example of external obsolescence, where they will reduce the value of your property if they're close by. So this house in S.A.R.A, when I had to value what his house was worth, I had to take off some money because of the fact that he had high tension wires in his backyard. The next thing is mold. Mold is a microscopic organism that comes in the presence of moisture and the absence of good airflow and light. Mold can affect people who have allergies or asthma or who are sensitive to mold. In the southern states, they have a different kind of mold that's called a black mold that is very dangerous, but that species of mold does not survive up here in New Jersey's climate. Even though the mold may be black, it's not that really dangerous black mold, but we still don't want mold in the house. So the way we get rid of mold is he sprays it with a mixture of 50 parts water to 1 part bleach and then scrubs it off. You can also use a mold fogger that sprays a moldicide. You can also cut all the sheetrock out and re-sheetrock it. But what you really want to do is remove the moisture source. Whatever is causing that ceiling and wall to be wet is what's bringing in the mold. And so you want to make sure you remove that moisture source. And we have a lot of mold in New Jersey this time of year. Don't forget, it's very humid out. We have mold in basements all the time. And again, there is no law that says the seller has to fix mold. Remediating for mold is a negotiation between the buyer and the seller. Negotiation. Now we're going to start talking about some laws that are applied to industry. And again, we had a lot of pollution in New Jersey. They've been working very hard on getting it cleaned up and stopping it. One of the laws is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980. This was a law that created a mechanism for forcing people to clean up polluted areas. The problem with this law is it made everybody in the chain of ownership individually and jointly responsible. Everybody in the chain of ownership. So very, very strict and tough law. And it's not a regulatory statute, but it's a cleanup and liability law. So in other words, it doesn't tell people how to treat their waste. It just tells them what they have to do to clean it up. And the fund cleans up abandoned or orphaned toxic sites by imposing strict cleanup liability on all the parties responsible for creating it. Again, a very, very strict law. Now, almost too strict. Almost too strict. So in 1986, it expired, and instead of renewing it, they created the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, and that's called S.A.R.A. That extended and amended CERCLA, and it lists extremely hazardous chemicals that must be reported to authorities when spilled or released, but also it gave a mechanism by which you could have innocent landowner immunity. So under S.A.R.A., S-A.R.A., you could have innocent landowner immunity. And that means if you ended up with a piece of property that was polluted and the pollution was caused by a third party, the property was acquired by you after the placement of the polluting substance, the owner did not know of the problem, there's a typo, I'm sorry, and number 4 is due care was exercised to determine if there was a hazardous waste. So if you ended up with a property and you did all these things and it turned out to be polluted, then you would not be responsible to clean it up. Okay? So S.A.R.A. gave innocent landowner immunity. The next law that has to do with commercial endeavors is I.S.R.A., the Industrial Site Recovery Act. And in this rule, in the I.S.R.A., every commercial endeavor is given a code. And that code then determines whether or not you have to have an environmental impact statement done in order to sell the property. And you might have a code for something. In Perth Amboy, I sold a hotel and I sold a gas station one year. The hotel, the I.S.R.A. code said it did not need to have an environmental impact statement. So how are you going to pollute in a hotel? But the gas station, its code said you did have to have an environmental impact statement, and we found leaks in that gas station. So again, if you're selling a commercial endeavor, gas station, anything that was used commercially, you've got to go to Trenton, you've got to, or look up the code in Trenton. You can find it on the web, and we'll see what the I.S.R.A. code is, and then look at their chart, and it'll tell you whether or not you have to have that environmental impact statement. And again, so much pollution in New Jersey because so many manufacturers used to just dump their byproducts and their waste into the groundwater. The next thing is New Jersey is a very densely populated state, the most densely populated state. And in New Jersey, we have a lot of anti-development laws, and the purpose of those laws is to stop development in environmentally sensitive areas. So we have the Highlands Preservation Act, the Coastlands Act, the Pinelands Act, all different areas that are environmentally sensitive that we are not allowed any longer to develop on. That's what makes land so expensive in New Jersey, because there's so many areas that we can't develop and we don't have much land to begin with. All right, this is the Pinelands land capability. So again, you know, depending on what the codes are, what you can build or can't build. By the way, this is very important to New Jersey, because underneath this whole Pinelands area, there's a gigantic aquifer, a big lake of very fresh water, and we want to really protect that natural resource. That is a big natural resource, that aquifer. All right, so we want to keep a clean planet. And with environmental things, remember that none of them required the seller to fix them. They were all by negotiation, except for CERCLA, which was an industrial act. And CERCLA was amended and extended by S.A.R.A, which would potentially give you innocent landowner immunity. The kind of questions you're going to get on the test about this chapter is about S.A.R.A and what were the 4 conditions that allowed you to claim innocent landowner immunity. And it's the pollution was caused by a third party, the property was acquired by the owner after the placement of the substance, the owner did not know of the problem, due care was exercised to determine if there was hazardous waste. The other question that's quite often asked on the test is a question about lead paint. And anything that was built before 1978, so 1977 and before, has to have a lead paint addendum. And in the lead paint addendum, the seller tells the buyer if he has any reports or any knowledge of any lead. The buyer receives the opportunity to do a lead assessment if he chooses. And if the buyer finds lead, the seller doesn't have to fix it. But if the buyer finds lead and the seller refuses to fix it, then the buyer can get out of the deal. So that's very important. Now, what we see day to day in older houses is asbestos, underground storage tanks, and if we have a well, we have to have that private well testing addendum. That's what we see on a daily basis. In newer houses that were built in the 70s and on up, we don't see too much of this because it was built after 77. If it was built 78 or on, there's no lead. We didn't use asbestos after that point to insulate anymore. A really funny side note is in really old houses, when they used to insulate the pipes, the reason they were insulating the pipes, and this is a basement pipe, this is a steam pipe in the basement, the reason they were insulating the pipes was not to save energy. The reason they were insulating the pipes was to keep the basement cold. And the reason they wanted to keep the basement cold was because people used to store their potatoes and some of their other foodstuffs in the basement where it was cool before we had refrigeration. When we only had ice boxes, where would you store stuff that had to be cold? You'd store it in the basement. And in the winter, you didn't want the heating pipes to heat up the basement, so you would wrap them with asbestos to keep the basement cool. And again, nowadays we have refrigerators, so it's not a big deal to take all that stuff off in the basement. But if you do take it off in the basement, you know, you are going to have to make sure, you should make sure it's a licensed remediation contractor and he's doing it correctly. All right, so that's a short course tonight on everything we really need to know for the test in order to pass the test and to do business. You'll be aware of all this stuff as you're looking at houses, whether you're representing a buyer, you can make comments about what you're seeing. If you're representing a seller, I like to tell a seller, let's get rid of any oil tanks you have now before we put it on the market, because why delay everything if you find a tank after you've got a buyer? And I have had houses take 4 years to get ready to sell after a bad leak on a tank. I have a house on the market now in South River where the cleanup has already been over $100,000 for a leaky oil tank. So again, I like to see those oil tanks gone sooner rather than later. All right, let's talk about a few more classes. I probably will run another short class tomorrow night. Tuesday night and Wednesday nights are the big normal big classes. Somebody asked today if I could please give a little bit more lead time about the classes and what they're going to be on. So I'll work on doing that. I've also been working on getting together a whole group of tests. So we're not sure how we're going to administer the test yet. If I go on Google Docs or Google Forms and do a quiz on Google Forms, we have to type them all out and put them in, and then go back and put the right answers in. The same thing on Quizlet. But we're working on having it so you can just take them online and get them graded. And then the class tests we're going to try to have online by the end of the week, so that you can take the class test online and see how you do, and it'll get self-graded. Until that happens, we'll just do test questions in class, and then we'll go over the answers. So we'll do another short chapter tomorrow night. I think it's going to be on taxes and the income and the impact of real estate on your taxes, and on like-kind exchanges, 1031 like-kind exchanges. I think that'll be the short class for tomorrow night. I appreciate you guys all showing up. We had 20 people show up for a Sunday evening class. That's really cool. And let's get this all done so you can get your license and get out there and make some money. All right. Let's see, we got a question. Oh, it's a thank you. Okay. You're welcome. Appreciate that. And we'll see you guys tomorrow night. Good night.
Thank you, Bruce.
Take care, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce.
Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce. Good night.